Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Catholic Mama, where you'll learn how to deepen and defend your faith, find comfort as we share the vocation of parenthood, and learn how to raise your children confidently Catholic. I'm your host, Christine Mooney-Flynn. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome back, or welcome for the first time, to the Catholic Mama podcast. Thank you for joining me. I am your host, Christine Mooney-Flynn. But save your applause, because as far as recorded conversations go, oh, there's a baby sneeze. As far as recorded conversations go, I have my favorite co-conversationalist here, Mr. Pat Flynn, my husband.
Always good to be back.
Our once a week
podcast, yes.
And because the people spoke and said how much they enjoy us together, we are now podcasting once a week, which is basically just recording a conversation that we might have, except there's less children screaming in the background.
Yeah, except for that baby sneeze, which we have. That's actually the great debate right now. What's cuter, a baby yawn or a baby sneeze? We haven't been able to.
That is a tough one. There. Look, it's on it got picked up.
Yeah, so they're a little special treat for all the gentle listeners. This is good for me, too, not just because I enjoy having these conversations, but I've been a little lazy with my own podcast recently. So
you've been very busy.
It just gives me a bit of extra content for me to share.
It also is nice, not that we're using the podcast, but at the very least, it is time that we have to take every week to talk to each other.
Indeed.
That's it, folks. If you want an in-home date, record a conversation that you have with your spouse, but just make sure that they know that they're being recorded.
Yeah, that's probably good policy. Well, we lucked out because we were planning on just having a normal day here at the house, and grandparents said, hey, bring the kids over, drop them off. We're like, all right, awesome. So we went to lunch and we were like, what do we want to do? We could go see a movie. And we're like, oh, there's not really any good movies out. We could do a podcast.
And here we are.
Here we are. But we had a very nice lunch, and now we're
here. I know. And you know what's funny is that the kids have no idea that this afternoon we were going to go to an arcade.
Yeah.
And now they're not going, but they have no idea. It's a good thing we didn't say anything.
I know. We will take them, though. We'll do that again. But whenever, they love going to their grandparents. So I'm sure even if we said arcade or grandparents,
they probably would have picked the grandparents.
Take the grandparents as well, because it's pretty much an arcade.
But I will seriously. But I will say that it is a lesson that we have learned that you want to prepare your kids for what's coming up, but you don't tell them that something's happening until you're like 100% sure it's happening, and that you are almost out the door.
Because then, as any parent will know, you will not stop hearing about it until it doesn't matter if it's 5 months in advance. That was the biggest. I think you told them about a trip one time we were going to make, and every single day,
yes,
they would ask if it was time to go to.
Because I was excited, and I wanted to share my excitement with the kids, and it completely backfired because by the time we got around to the trip or whatever it was, I was so annoyed.
Yep. So now it's like at this point, it's like, okay, kids, put your jackets on. We're going to Italy today. Yeah.
Speaking of, are we going to Italy? I looked up. I have points on my credit card, and I went to see. I was like, oh, that's a decent amount. Maybe that'll pay. It travels on there. Not even close.
Nope. So sorry. We're not going to Italy.
No, it's like 100,000 points per round trip ticket.
Yeah.
So we're not going anywhere. Not yet. I could buy a $25 gift card to Panda Express with how many points I have. Anyway.
Orange chicken.
Speaking of eating or not eating is actually really the subject of this podcast today. And my husband has quite literally written the book on fasting. At least the For Dummies book.
I am the original For Dummies author of the book on intermittent fasting. It is called Fast Diets for Dummies, which is a title I was terribly dissatisfied with. And my whole history of working with the For Dummies brand, which is under Wiley, wonderful publisher. I really don't have anything negative to say. But for all of my books I did with them, we always had much contention over the title.
It's funny, too, because they said that they didn't want... The idea of fasting in general just sounded too religious. And yet... that is exactly what people search for now. So they missed out on the SEO.
They did, and that was their objection. I'm like, well, let's just call it what it should be called, Fasting for Dummies, because the For Dummies book that I wrote was a survey of the different approaches to intermittent fasting, like a typical For Dummies book. Here's what you need to know. Here's how to get started. And I think it stands up really well. People seem to really get a lot out of it, but for reasons that you say, didn't want to call it Fasting for Dummies because they thought that sounded too religious, which is funny because we're going to talk about the theology of fasting on this episode. And they didn't want to call it Intermittent Fasting for Dummies because they thought that was too complicated for dummies.
So fast diets, which I think is ambiguous.
It is like that seems like if somebody is really a dummy, if they're kind of stupid, if they're a little short, then maybe like clarity would be helpful. But
are these diets that work quickly? It doesn't.
I know, but this was. But anyway, it's done well. All the For Dummies books, thanks be to God, have done well. So they wanted me to do a compilation book a little bit later. So, whatever. But it is what it is.
We bring that up to say that while neither of us are medical professionals by any means, Pat went to school for accounting and finance. I went to school for anthropology.
Technically, economics and finance.
Oh, economics.
Accounting
I'm sorry.
was my minor.
Got it. Now you are, and now your master's work is philosophy. We are no way in anywhere in there anything like a medical professional, but because of both of our backgrounds, but you're specifically in the fitness realm and healthy eating.
Yep.
You've become an expert in fasting, and so
indeed. And
fasting, and it's funny is that when you first introduced me to fasting, and when you first started doing your research many years ago on all this stuff, I remember you came across the data point that it's possible that, especially in the Mediterranean diet, why it works so well and why there's such longevity for people who follow it from the start of their life to finish is because there's a lot of fasting in there because they're Orthodox.
Well, that's an interesting thing is when people look at nutritional research, they often miss some of these important features of how people live that seem entirely relevant to their health outcomes. So it's not just what people eat, which is important, but also how much they eat and when they eat. And all these things are deeply sort of intertwined. So I always kind of found it interesting that a lot of these quote unquote blue zone regions of the world that where people tend to live a very long time, for example, there's a lot of longevity, a lot of health associated with these regions. If you compare the regions, like what they eat in a qualitative sense is often very different, right? You have some in the Mediterranean region, you have some in Japan, and you have others that are like very essentially high fat, very low carb, kind of different than the people who just eat rice all the time. So you say, okay, well, what are the commonalities here? Because the diets in terms of like what they're eating are kind of different, but the commonalities are pretty basic. Honestly, they eat foods that are minimally processed and close to nature. They moderate their intake, and many of them go for significant amounts of period without food. They tend to have a cyclical approach to eating. They'll eat very moderately, they'll occasionally fast, and they will occasionally feast. Now, I guess the interesting and somewhat ironic thing is when I first got into fasting, it was for pure physiological and psychological benefits. There's been a lot of research done in the past 20 years, really good research on just the pure health benefits of intermittent fasting that has done a lot of myth busting of all the very poor nutritional advice.
Starvation mode and all that.
That we've gotten in the past 50, 60 years of like you need to have your sugary bowl of breakfast cereal if you want to have a productive day, which is just pretty, as close to nonsense as you can get. And it's really been quite, I would say, affirmative of a sort of eating style that was more or less assumed throughout, or if it wasn't assumed, it was sort of imposed throughout much of history, especially much of Catholic and church history. And one thing that has surprised me since we became Catholic, and I started wanting to look more into the theological and spiritual sides of fasting, is you look at sort of how many Christians would have eaten throughout history. And what you realize is a pattern that goes something like this. Like they would have eaten, pretty moderately most days of the week. They would have fasted pretty intensely or eaten very little 2 days a week. And then they would have feasted and really kind of enjoyed themselves typically 1 day a week. And by golly, if that like hasn't been borne out by most of the research showing like this is a really like healthy way to eat, to have a sort of cyclical intensity to your diet where, okay, you have moderation most days, and then maybe 1 to 2 days you kind of crank the intensity, you fast, you exhibit a little bit more temperance, you make a little bit more of a sacrifice. And then 1 day a week, very importantly, people forget this, is you ease those restrictions. You really feast, you enjoy, you celebrate. And this cyclical nature of eating has, I would say, enormous physiological and psychological benefits. But then there's all the theological reasons of why people were doing this. And it just seems really interesting. Of course, as Catholics, we don't believe in coincidences, but it just happens to be the case that, oh yeah, there's a lot of really good research now in the past 20 years that supports this as a very healthy, productive lifestyle. Okay. And the sustainability to something like this as well.
Truth just pervades anything about Catholicism, doesn't it?
It is funny, and it's like, okay, even if that wasn't there, it might still be beneficial spiritually or theologically, but it is like you can really make the argument from nutritional research that this would be a pretty ideal, and it's going to vary from person to person, of course, in some ways, but a very practical way for people to eat if they're interested in longevity, promoting health, maintaining a healthy body composition, and being psychologically healthy too. And I think that's the point that people miss when it comes to the mistake people make with dieting is they think, I just got to keep compounding restrictions, keep cutting calories, keep cutting whatever it is. And then everybody realizes this, you get to a point where it just breaks down. It becomes unsustainable and you just fly off the rails. So without having that feast day, that mini Easter as Catholics have it, right? That is that sort of physiological and psychological break where you can replenish yourself and restore yourself. All dieting is doomed to fail. So it's that inherent, you need to have some type of cyclical feature in your dieting lifestyle.
And when you add on the theological component of all this, it isn't just like, oh, I'm slogging through Wednesday of fasting just so I can get to the next day, or just to get this certain number on the scale or whatever it is. It's so much more hollow when you just look at it from a purely physical standpoint. But then when you add on the reasons for the fasting and the reasons for the feasting, and then also just understanding that you can't just fast and feast, there needs to be moderation in there because it's just intelligent. It becomes so much more meaningful.
Significant. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's easier to follow. Right. On Fridays, it is much easier for me not to eat food, realizing that, I just don't get to eat for a couple hours, but Jesus, was tortured and hung on a cross.
You could be like that like stereotypical Catholic mom. Oh, you're hungry? Well, you're hungry? Well, guess what? Jesus was nailed to a piece of wood.
That's what I say to myself, and also to our children. But no,
fair enough, right? But you're right. Is that I was always interested in fitness from both a purely physiological standpoint and also partly a vanity standpoint too. Is like, okay, to help advance my fitness goals. I think it helped me to look good and blah blah blah. And that wears thin eventually. Like you just like that it doesn't sustain you for, I would say like a lot of elements as fitness is like it kind of grew stale after a while. But then when you have the theology there and you realize the deeper spiritual significance, not only does that reinvigorate your enthusiasm for fasting, it makes it so much easier to do because it's so much more significant. There's like existential significance here now, not just, I want to keep a low body fat or something like that. But, things like, so obviously, and this is kind of the shame is that in terms of like fasting was kind of the norm historically for the longest time. And the way we eat, like our contemporary way of eating is like 5 minutes old, historically speaking. The fact that like people think that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And if you skip breakfast, you're going to be in dire straits. Utter mythology in terms of like if just physiologically speaking. Believe me, you can skip breakfast. You're going to be just fine. Most of the time, I hardly don't eat any breakfast. But like, it's just important for people to realize that fasting was so assumed for so long. I mean, let's just maybe start unpacking some of the theology of it. There's really important biblical data for fasting. It's true that Jesus never commands us to fast, but part of the reason he doesn't command it is he just assumes it, right? So first off is Christ himself fasted famously for 40 days before he began his public ministry. We have the sort of biblical support of certain elements of spiritual warfare can only really be battled through not just prayer, but prayer and fasting. So fasting was just such an essential part of the culture at the time that you wouldn't have to really tell people to do it. In the same sense, you don't have to tell people to breathe. It's just what you would do. And you see, again, it was sort of assumed by our blessed Lord, and when he gives when he tells people not to pray like hypocrites, he also says, when you fast, don't look all, glumly. Yeah, glumly, right? So this is just it's just assumed that this is just part of the spiritual life, part of the spiritual discipline. So, part of the reason we fast is just in imitation of Christ, like many of the other things we try to do to imitate Christ. And that it seems to be, for many different reasons, a really important part of our spiritual development and our development of virtue and things like that, which we can get into as we move along here.
So real quick, before we go into deeper into that, I just want to briefly outline what a week of fasting and feasting in moderation might look like, right? So we have Monday and Tuesday of moderation, right? Wednesday historically would have been a fast day. Do you know why?
It was when Jesus was betrayed.
That's right. It is in kind of a reparation for the sin of Judas.
Yeah, so there's theological significance. Wednesday and Friday aren't arbitrary. And, on Friday we give up meat. St. Thomas Aquinas would say Christ gave up his flesh on Friday, so we give up flesh on Friday. Now, the church realized that, there were regional dispensations because, throughout the world, this obviously becomes a lot more difficult for some people, depending where they get their food versus other people. So the unfortunate thing is, fairly in terms of, again, history, fairly recently, a lot of these restrictions started to seem somewhat arbitrary. And I think the shame is, rather than people going and looking at the deeper logic of why these restrictions were in place, they just abandoned them. And I think that's a great shame. That's been a great detriment. So I've become kind of taken a personal mission of mine. I want to reinvigorate these traditions because the reasons they were, even if they did start to seem somewhat arbitrary, the deeper logic and the principles behind them are still as sound as ever. And anybody would do really well to understand why they were there and to begin to implement them in their life in at least some capacity.
Yep. So then we have Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday and Saturday as moderation days. Wednesday and Friday as fasting for, in reparation for the sin of Judas, and then Christ dying on the cross. And then Sunday, we are celebrating. Every Sunday is a mini Easter, where we are rejoicing in the fact that our God rose from the dead.
Yeah.
And everything, all of his promises are real.
And that celebration is so important. So just as you take the fast seriously, you take the celebration, you take the feast seriously.
So if any of you have ever followed any kind of nutrition or eating plan, I'm sure at some point they talk about cheat days or refeed days, and that's it. And if you put it on a Sunday, there you go. You're celebrating your mini Easter. And what I really like is that it really helps to temper, even on your Sunday, I would imagine it really helps to temper and make sure that you're not going to become an all-out glutton, because if Friday you're fasting, well, you can't go out Friday night and enjoy wine or beer and dessert or whatever, or pizza. Or I guess you could have pizza.
But that's important because the idea is that sacrifice. So is it really a sacrifice if you give up meat, but then you have
cheese pizza?
Yeah, a 5-course lobster dinner.
Yeah, a pan of lasagna.
Yeah, and that's why it's important to understand the deeper logic, the deeper theological reasons that we're doing this. So and so much of the fast is in the same way that we kind of wear scapulars, right? It's to give us those sort of nudging and almost itchy reminders. Those itchy reminders to keep us bound to those theological mysteries and the life of Christ. So that way, throughout the day, we have these constant reminders to live in imitation of Christ, to strive for holiness, etc. And honestly, the discomfort of hunger is a powerful, constant reminder sometimes. Yeah.
So Friday, you're fasting. Saturday's a moderation day. So you shouldn't go all out. And then Sunday, you should be fasting through Mass from, the night before. And we've been going to a 2:00 Latin Mass. So I know in the past, you've been doing it longer than I have on the Sundays. But then by the time that you eat on a Sunday and knowing that most of everybody has to go to work the next day, you can't go all out anyway. Mm-hmm. And it becomes a feast, but not a gluttonous one.
And that's a key,
right? Because you don't want to fast and have moderation and then have the sin of gluttony on top of all this, and plus not feel well the next day.
Yeah. So, you said that's typically what we do, and of course, there's other feast days as well through the liturgical calendar.
That's another thing. I know. Yeah. Look, if you have family feast days, your birthdays or saints, there are things to celebrate besides a Sunday.
The church has, rightfully so, many celebrations throughout the year where restrictions are eased and you're encouraged to feast. And seasons as well. We have Advent, we have Lent. So, again, the cyclical nature is sort of built in, and I would really encourage people to try and follow that. Try and follow that liturgical calendar. I think you'll find so much enrichment there.
Okay, so
what you said, I think, again, is important. Yeah, so we go to a Latin Mass on Sundays, typically at 2, and I'll often extend. Come the end of the Latin Mass, which is, I think last time was like an hour and a half.
Yeah,
I am pretty hungry at that point.
3:30 in the afternoon, then, right?
Boy, does that feast just taste absolutely delicious.
And because if you have to fast to really enjoy a feast, you have to take away to really enjoy when it's given. I mean, the same idea is like, Jesus was lost. Mary and Joseph lost Jesus for 3 days. They were fasting from their son, not willingly, and then they found him again. And that's one of the joyful mysteries that we celebrate, right? The finding of Jesus. The same idea. We fast as reparation for sins, or taking away, remembering a time when Jesus was in the tomb or suffering himself, and then he gives us and
I want to also discuss So people fast historically for many reasons. So what are some of these reasons? One is, again, to bind yourself to a theological mystery. That's obviously very important. Number 2, people forget this, but many people throughout history would fast just so they would have more to give to charity. I eat less, I have more to give away.
Yeah, so that's another thing. Yeah, so if you will notice, if you commit to fasting, once or twice a week, and eat more moderately, you're probably not going to spend as much on your grocery bills. And that shouldn't just go to line your pocket.
Yes. So think about that when you're fasting in many different areas of life, because you can quote fast from other things aside from food. We can quibble about whether that's technically fasting or not. But again, the same principles apply. You make the sacrifice in your life so you can increase the amount of charity you give to others. And I think that's a hugely important aspect of fasting that has so much significance. But then the other big thing is temperance, right? The idea of fasting as a means of governing our passions and our appetites. We are rational animals, and that our passions and our appetites can sometimes bubble up so aggressively that it overrules reason. And this is where we have people struggling with things like addiction, obesity. So fasting is a tool like exercise, where we work to discipline our desires to make what is really good for us at first accessible, and then hopefully over time effortless. And that's what perfection and flourishing in the sense of being a rational animal is. And that's why people like St. Thomas Aquinas would say that these virtues are perfections of our powers, the perfections of what truly makes us the kinds of creatures that God intends for us to be. So fasting is a means of temperance, trying to not to eliminate our passions or appetites, but to and not to punish ourselves, but to govern ourselves.
And that there's intense freedom in that.
And that's the key, right? It's not about just punishing yourself and feeling guilty. That's what we want to avoid. That's vicious behavior. That's not virtuous at all. Rather, it's government, finding the appropriate amounts so that way we can flourish. We can enjoy things that are good in and of themselves. Food is good in and of itself. But you can have so much of a good thing that it turns it rotten. And that is kind of the predicament that we find ourselves in modern culture today, where we have this blessing of abundance of food, whereas this historically has not. Usually people had to fear the opposite of famine and starvation. We have the opposite problem, where we have so much of a good thing that it can turn it rotten, and people really struggle with obesity and gluttony. And fasting is the tool that we can use to develop that virtue of temperance.
Yep. And on a strictly practical standpoint, if you are a person who feels like you are governed by your hunger pangs and get hangry when you don't eat, fasting is a great way to get rid of that. I used to get hangry all the time. And then I started fasting on every day I was fasting up until a certain point. Like I would eat from 4 to 8 o'clock at night maybe, and that was it. Oh, bless you. So I had 20-hour fast a day for most days of the week. And it was in doing that where I stopped getting hangry, got a hold of any feelings of hunger, so I can just hunger. So I can I realized that my body and my mind have kind of aligned where if I'm hungry, it's not the end of the world. Even still, even though it's been years since I've done those 20-hour fasts per day, I don't recall getting hangry ever since then.
Yeah, and fasting, like exercise, is something that everybody needs to ease into, and that they should adjust according to where they are. So if you have never fasted before, in the same sense, if you haven't exercised in 30 years, it would be immensely foolish to go throw yourself into an Ironman.
Right.
You'll either quit immediately or you'll get hurt, and you'll be immediately discouraged, and you'll be like, this seems impossible. Yet people kind of do that with fasting. They're used to this frequent eating routine. They're not, they don't have that sort of metabolic flexibility to really handle the rigor of fasting. And it is a rigor. It's a stress like exercise. But the idea is, if you apply it in the appropriate amounts, it's a eustress. It's a positive stress, a good for you stress.
All right, eustress spelled EUSTRESS.
Versus a distress, which would be a negative stress. And of course, it's always the dose that determines that in relation to where the person is at. So that's why in my Fast Diets for Dummies, I just go over these different approaches that you can get started with fasting because, some people are very aggressive with it and do lots of fasting and do really well, in the same sense that people do the same thing with exercise. But that doesn't mean that that's an appropriate starting point.
So what is an appropriate starting point?
Honestly, I think the Catholic approach is a perfect starting point. You have, your days that you've outlined where you eat sort of moderately. And you can decide if you want to fast on those days or not. Maybe you'll just fast through morning. Maybe you'll skip breakfast and start with lunch, or maybe you'll just eat 3 square meals a day. So one thing I think that is helpful is eliminate snacking. Just if you're just get used to having space between meals. Get used to having that little bit of hunger and being okay with it. And the same thing in a sense of when you're exercising, getting used to having that little bit of discomfort and being okay with it. Get comfortable being uncomfortable to some extent. Then 2 days a week, have something of a little bit more aggressive of a fast. And maybe that is where you fast for 15 to 18 hours. And that might sound like a lot, but realize that a lot of that is done when you're sleeping. So figure if you finish your meal the night before by 6 p.m., you're eating by 9 a.m., somewhere between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. the next day. And that's very reasonable. So you're really just kind of pushing breakfast back a couple hours than you might normally. And you can still have coffee and tea, just nothing with calories in it. And so maybe you'll do that 2 days a week, Wednesday and Friday. And then, on Sunday, you just enjoy yourself. You ease restrictions. You have a nice big breakfast with your family. And, if you want to take the kids out for pizza and ice cream or whatever you want to do. And, really just it's a restriction-free day. Again, like you said, you're not going crazy. We're not trying to overcompensate and just, completely file.
Oh, my God, I've got to get everything in because I can't eat this tomorrow.
But we're celebrating. We're feasting.
And really, I think once you realize that it's not just a cheat day, but it is a day to celebrate Christ's resurrection, how much you indulge will change.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And what people realize is if you have a weight loss goal or a body composition goal or a health goal, this will be really helpful because what keeping, everything else equal, having that cyclical intensity to how you eat, having some days that are moderate, some days that are a little more aggressive, and one day where you really feast. For most people, most of the time, that's going to take a pretty large chunk of calories out of your diet. And that's going to have a lot of benefit. You're going to see your biomarkers improve. You're going to see your body fat go down.
Let's just talk real quick because I know if you don't eat for 15 to 18 hours a day, it would be difficult to match up with however many calories that you would have eaten had you had food since the moment you woke up in the morning. But people are very hungry by the end of a fast. So how can they not undermine themselves either?
Yes. So this is the key. You want to make sure that you're challenged but successful. Because if you push too far, too long, and then you overcompensate, that could be a problem, right? Because calories still do matter very much. Now, what you eat matters as well, because what you eat often determines how much you eat. So it's a sometimes people make it either or. It's really a both and. So one thing you can do is, again, make sure that you're starting with some fasting period where you're challenged, but you can transition successfully to eating without going overboard. So just picking a fasting window that you get hungry, but maybe not hangry, and adjusting that accordingly. Another thing to do is when you end your fast, this is, I think, a really powerful tip. Before you have a meal, have a protein shake. And then just wait 30 minutes and trust the protein shake. And by that, you can just make it at home, get like a protein powder, have like 20 to 30 grams of protein, maybe throw in some fresh fruits and vegetables, some chia seeds for some fiber, and just make that, your fast breaker, your break fast, your breakfast, literally, whenever you have that. And then what that will do is it will give you protein and fiber, which is extremely satiating, and it'll sort of bring you back to quote unquote normal. And
without you opening a box of crackers and eating the whole thing.
Yeah. So I have a saying that I say with kind of like my fitness audience is like, trust the shake, trust the protein shake. If you're very hungry, I know you want to just go for that huge barbecue bacon cheeseburger. And maybe you can, if it's Sunday, totally fine, go for it. But just do that shake first. Like end your fast with that shake. There's other alternatives. So you could do a salad or something like that. Or soup.
But I'll tell you what, though, especially if you're fasting on a Wednesday and Friday, especially Fridays during Lent specifically, but you should be doing it Fridays throughout the whole year. You're not eating meat coming off of that. And I know for me, on those days, it can be much easier to replace meat with some kind of carbohydrates instead.
Oh, yeah.
So going for bread, more crackers, pasta, whatever it is that has, meat free, but high calorie and high carb. So starting, ending with a soup, a brothy soup, a protein shake.
A veggie soup is a great option.
Yeah.
And just having all that liquid and vegetables takes up a lot of space with very few calories, and it really helps with satiety.
Right. So that when you get to the point where you're eating your meal, you are not, wolfing it down and not enjoying it and just trying to get into your mouth as fast as possible.
We've all been there, believe me, right? And I think that would be an extremely practical way to start that would match up very well with the Catholic liturgical calendar.
Yeah.
And awesome, because you're going to feel good. I promise you. It's like exercise. I guess we'll finish with that, is that it's one of these things that you start, it can be difficult to start, but then you start to see the benefits from it. And then once you start doing it for long enough, like exercise, and it becomes a habit, you look back and you realize, how did I ever do without it?
Yeah. And especially if you're fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, to make sure that if you are feeling hungry, one, like we touched on before, you're giving that any extra money that you would have spent, say, buying yourself breakfast or lunch, you're giving that to charity. Mm-hmm. And then also, mortification. It's a good thing.
Love it.
Right? Offering your suffering up. It's something that will benefit. Well, who knows who is going to benefit in the afterlife, mm-hmm. right? There are plenty you can offer your suffering up for the soul's purgatory. Mm-hmm. But also it helps to sanctify you. Mm-hmm. And so there's a great amount of benefit to be had from being hungry and from withstanding.
That's correct. All suffering is opportunity.
Right. I feel like we're going to talk about something else along these lines. I just wanted to get into something. I had it a second ago.
It's your show. You're in charge.
I don't remember it.
Oh, well.
Mom brain.
We tried.
But anyway, so we're getting close. I mean, if you are listening to this and it is, still heavily into winter, and we have Lent coming up, so testing out fasting as we're leading up to Lent can make you feel more confident in doing it throughout Lent, and hopefully deepen your Lenten devotionals or prayer times or whatever as we get to Easter. But this is useful for any other time. Advent is a mini Lent. You can always do more fasting then. Ordinary time. Look, there's no bad time to fast.
If you want to go crazy, look up the medieval fasting practices in the church, the black fasts, and man, have we grown soft is essentially what you'll realize.
And it is so hard. Suffering is a good thing for us in a lot of ways. It is so difficult to voluntarily do that. But like we've touched on several times already in the past half an hour, if you understand the theological underpinnings for why you should suffer a little bit, it becomes much more doable, and it's something almost enjoyable, right? You know, good things are coming from this.
It does. It gives opportunities for virtue, to break down superficiality, to break down ego, to increase in charity. The theological, spiritual opportunities that can be found in suffering are really some of the most valuable opportunities in life. So, yeah, definitely. I mean, and fasting is just one small but important way that people get started with this. So that is about all that I have on that.
Wonderful. You know what? Do you want to give a copy away of your book?
Which one? Fast Diets?
Yeah.
Do we have some?
We do.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Signed copy?
Sure. Signed copy. I guess we still have some copies in the basement.
We do. I think
the publisher always sends us boxes of these books. I don't remember how many.
But that might be fun.
Sure.
Okay.
Let's do it.
All right.
What do they got to do?
What do they got to do?
You're the boss. Email. How about just keep it simple? Send an email. We'll pick a winner or two. Yeah. We'll have to see how many copies we have, but we can give a few away.
Yep. Okay. So just send me an email, right?
Or no, let's do this.
Okay.
How about if you enjoy this lovely podcast, wherever you're listening, please consider writing a nice review on either iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play, and then email either Christine or myself, depending where you're listening, with a screenshot of that review, and you will automatically be entered into the giveaway. My email is patflynn@chroniclesofstrength.com. Yours is
Christine@thecatholicmama.com.
All right, so one more time. Please leave a review on either iTunes,
For the
Stitcher,
Catholic
or
Mama?
Google Play for either of the podcasts.
Got
they
it.
could be
Okay.
listening on
Yeah, that's
so
right.
Wherever
Okay.
you're listening for that podcast, and then email a screenshot of that to either Christine or me, and we will put you in, and we'll pick a winner within a week deadline. So week deadline.
Okay.
Simple.
And I will put the information and emails in the show notes as well, just as a reminder to go back and look. Good luck.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Don't forget to head over to thecatholicmama.com to get your free copy of How to Talk to Your Kids About God. This handy little ebook will teach you how to broach the topic of God with your children, or how to respond to your kids when they want to talk about God, as well as give you answers to 7 of the trickiest questions about the faith that Christian parents face. You'll love the easy-to-understand grown-up answers, the pared-down but not talked-down answers you can share with your kids, plus recommended resources if you'd like to deepen your understanding of the topic. Get yours free at thecatholicmama.com.
Hi, everyone. Dr. John Aquaviva here, author, professor of exercise science, and host of Faith in Sport on WCAT Radio. Please join us as we discuss current events in the sports world, bring on inspiring guests, and discuss how our Catholic faith impacts all who are involved in sport, the athletes, the coaches, the referees, and yes, even the fans. So join me, Dr. John Aquaviva, as I discuss my 2 favorite topics, my faith and the world of sport, on the Faith in Sports show here on WCAT Radio.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.